Microsoft gets into the vibe coding game, they have launched something called GitHub Spark. The slogan here is dream it, see it, ship it. And it is essentially a cloud-based IDE with a LLM chat interface attached on the left and real-time preview over on the right. It allows you to build and iterate your way, ship with a click, familiar tools baked into GitHub, and it also requires zero setup. If I'm understanding correctly, and I haven't had a chance to use it properly myself, or use it at all myself, but it seems to be addressing many of the problems I've had with some of the other tools where it's sort of like the database just works, the API keys just work, and you can actually add LLM features to your app, not just use an LLM to make the app. And so, it seems actually, at least the positioning of it is quite a bit better than some of the basic vibe coding tools. But I imagine there is plenty of jank down in the usage of it, like most Microsoft tools. Yaniv, have you had a chance to see the announcement, play with it, or what is your first impressions hearing about it today?
My very first impression was a bit of a yawn because there are already a lot of vibe coding tools. And GitHub is in an interesting position because I would say that GitHub Copilot was the first AI enablement phase of coding, right? This was the first AI tool that developers were regularly using as part of their coding workflow. But I feel that GitHub and, Microsoft behind them really kind of lost their leadership quite a long time ago. We had Cursor, we had Windsurf, we have Claude Code, all of these things. And GitHub Copilot has become this kind of sleepy also-ran that hasn't really kept up. People use GitHub Copilot, but there's no buzz or excitement about it anymore. All of that has gone to their competitors. So when I say that GitHub has now launched Spark, I'm like, well, that's just another example of, them being a little bit behind the times now, which is probably true. But a couple of things have very slightly made me more excited. And it touches on what you were saying. So first of all, if you go to the announcement, there's a little executive summary at the top and it says, what's it for? And it says, building and sharing personalized micro apps, which are called Sparks. And, I think that also relates to what you were saying, Chris, that it works out of the box. So this is actually somewhere positioning wise and therefore product experience wise, somewhere in between the sorts of things that you can do inside Claude, the artifacts where Claude will actually make a little micro app for you, just right in the chat window on a canvas. And the full-fledged vibe coding tools like Lovable, Bolt.new, V0, all of those. It's saying our aspiration isn't to use this even as a prototyping tool. They've put a personal productivity bent on this, or just a personal usage tool, which is like, hey, what if anyone could make an app for themselves? What would that be like? And I think that's interesting. It's smart. It's a slightly different perspective on all of this. And it's, like you said, Chris, it's not too ambitious. So all of this stuff where people, try to vibe code their way to an actual multi-million-dollar startup and then suddenly the database gets deleted, that's not going to happen because it is setting its sights lower. I think that's interesting. Works out of the box, works really well. There was a vibe coding tool called Base 44 that went from launch to acquisition, $100+ million acquisition in under 6 months. And their whole thing was full stack. It was opinionated. It had all of the different elements, database, deployment built in. You didn't get to choose which backend. And because of that, you didn't have API keys. They hosted it all and it was more reliable. So I think that is a smart point of view for what GitHub are trying to do. So not the biggest story of the year or even of the day, but yeah, I'm interested to see where this goes.
So here's the thing, Yaniv. I actually disagree with you. And I actually think that Microsoft is lying to us. If they were building a sort of everyday user tool where anyone can make little Sparky apps, they could or should or would build that into Office 365. You should be able to kind of spin up an app if you're an everyday worker and make a little quick applet or Spark, as they call it, for yourself. You wouldn't have GitHub integration. You wouldn't have that, IDE looking UX. I think what they're actually doing is they're lowballing the vision. They're describing sort of an MVP, and they're setting the expectations low. But their ambition for this thing, I would imagine, is to become a serious workhorse IDE over time. Either that, or the product managers shut the bed. Right, like I really think if it's like little, do you remember back in the day you had like Microsoft Access and you had like
Loved
VB.net.
Microsoft Access. My first paid tech work was building Microsoft Access DVs. Got me through university.
I was involved in a lot of that as well, and you could make these little like macro apps, and you could build apps into Office and into Excel. I think that taken to the next level is where this goes for what you described, which is anyone anytime can build a little applet and go inside their productivity suite, whether it's Google's Workspace or Microsoft 365. I think they're pitching this at that level right now. Oh, well, don't worry about it. It's just these little applets. It's not for. I think that's just because they're trying to manage expectations and start with an MVP. But before you respond to that, one last point on the opinionated piece. I do think these things need to be more opinionated, especially since they're not as good as they think they are just yet. They need to have the best practices baked in for great auth, magic links, databases, all this sort of stuff. Because at least in my experience, and it may be user error, but every time you try to get them to build great auth experiences, great user management, great database, image upload, whatever, they just shit the bed. And so they really need to have some sort of templating thing. And I actually spoke to the Bolt CEO offline about this when we interviewed him, and he was saying, yeah, they were thinking about sort of templated prompts or pre-canned prompts that would help you fast forward to some of these things. But yeah, the LLMs need a little bit more opinions during their development process.
It's funny. I was on their sort of press release that where I quoted that, but then if you go to their full page, it already is saying more, right? The main page is now saying dream it, see it, ship it. It helps you transform your ideas into full stack intelligent apps and publish with a single click. So yeah, even their positioning is contradictory right now. And looking at the actual screenshot, it looks a hell of a lot like Cursor. So I'd say maybe this is trying to be some hybrid, right? I've talked on the show before that we have what are called the vibe coding tools, which are top down. It's like put in a prompt and it'll build the app for you and you don't need to code. And then maybe if you can code, you can look at the code later and tweak it. Versus bottom up tools like Cursor, Windsurf, Claude Code, where really the expectation is you are an engineer, you know how to code, you give it incremental instructions in more technical language around what you want it to build and you build it. And I've said, I've been skeptical about the top down ones. And I think bottom up is where most of the traction is. I think GitHub, for those who used to like watching Silicon Valley, maybe they're trying something that's a bit middle out, right? Which is they're saying, hey, we're not top down, we're not bottom up, we're middle out. We are a vibe coding tool. We do the hosting, the deployment, the prod, and all of that. But also, we're an IDE, like the code takes center stage rather than being kind of buried underneath the app that you're building. I'll have to reflect some more and probably try it out to see whether this is a smart thing to do or not. But what GitHub has as an advantage is it has a near monopoly. It has ubiquity, let's say, as a source control tool. Everybody uses GitHub. Not everyone uses GitHub Copilot, but everyone uses GitHub, and that's a very powerful place to be. You don't have to import your repositories or anything like that. GitHub is there, and you can start building with it. So I think it could be interesting. Yeah, let's watch this space. I think you're right, Chris, to say this is a bit of a bigger story than it seems.
Yeah, and also earlier you said they were ahead on Copilot, but now it's sort of lost its luster. Shocking that Microsoft would be ahead on something and then shit the bed and fail to improve it over time. It's this is the story of Microsoft, I think. From the browser to the tablet to the cell phone to this day, Office 365 is a goddamn nightmare on the web, just a nightmare. And their authentication flow, the whole thing. I've been forced to use it for the last 12, 24 months with some of the startups I work with. And it's just like, it literally probably, it reduces my productivity by about 10 or 20%. Because I refuse to install their vaunted desktop apps as well.
GitHub is a slightly different case, right? It is an acquisition that Microsoft made. It has kept its own brand identity, very clever. I feel like they were doing for the developer community what Google did with YouTube. And I thought it was one of the smartest acquisitions of all time, just in terms of, positioning and everything. And I'd say I'd give the post-acquisition execution about a 5 or a 6 out of 10. I would not say they've shut the bed. What they haven't done is they haven't enshittified GitHub. Everybody still uses GitHub. It is still a delight to use for its core functionality. GitHub is where it's at. But I think in terms of actually capitalizing on that, saying, hey, what we can do as Microsoft is infuse lots of capital into what you do so that you can really build a preeminent developer tool chain build out from what we have. I feel like they have slow rolled it. They haven't really capitalized on that opportunity. And so GitHub now is not a particularly more, I was going to say it's not a particularly more powerful tool than when it was acquired. Maybe it's more powerful, but what they haven't really been able to do, with a partial exception of what I would say is GitHub Actions, which have actually gotten a decent amount of traction, is they've just not been able to sort of cross-sell, expand out from that core like version control and pull request sort of tool into being a ubiquitous developer tool. And I think that was a missed opportunity.
All right, well, those are our thoughts on Microsoft and their new GitHub Spark vibe coding IDE. What do you think? Is this going to be the future of development tools from Microsoft, or just another also ran for vibe coding? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments.